Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Cabinet of Curiosities on Our Own Devices. I'm Jean Messier, and today I am at the Manitoba Electrical Museum and Education Center in Winnipeg, having a look at some fascinating pieces of turn-of-the-century medical equipment. These are what are known as medical coils or medical batteries, and these were part of a trend in medicine in the late 19th and early 20th centuries called electrotherapy, in which electricity, particularly high-voltage, high-frequency electricity, was used to cure all sorts of ailments. Now, before we get started here, I think it's important to point out that this type of electrotherapy is distinct from the type of electrotherapy most people are familiar with, which is electroconvulsive therapy, or ECT, aka shock therapy, used in the treatment of mental illness. That type of electrotherapy was developed relatively recently and via a completely different path. So in 1934, a Hungarian psychiatrist named Ladislas Meduna made an interesting observation. He found that his patients who suffered from schizophrenia rarely suffered from epilepsy and vice versa. So he wondered whether these two illnesses were antagonistic and whether he could treat schizophrenia by inducing epileptic seizures. So at first, this type of therapy was induced chemically using a drug called metrazole or cardiazole, which when injected produced violent seizures. Later, a different procedure was developed using insulin, where patients would be given an overdose of insulin to put them into diabetic shock. They would be maintained in this state for several hours until they were revived with an infusion of glucose. However, it was quickly realized that these procedures were very labor-intensive. They required a lot of highly specialized staff and a lot of time to perform. And so in 1938, an Italian psychiatrist named Ugo Sarletti pioneered the use of electricity to induce seizures, and apparently he was inspired by the sight of pigs at a slaughterhouse being stunned with electricity prior to slaughter. And this became electroconvulsive therapy, which became the standard method of applying convulsive therapy for the remainder of the 20th century. However, it was eventually realized that Meduna's original observation was complete bunkum. There is actually no causal relationship between epilepsy and schizophrenia. And further, ECT was found to be ineffective against most types of mental illness, except for certain types of severe depression untreatable by other means. And this is why ECT is still used to this day in those cases, albeit in a more humane form where the patient is first sedated. Now, that was a bit of a tangent, but the whole point is that this type of electrotherapy developed along completely separate lines to ECT and is actually considerably older. So the application of electricity to medicine is very old indeed. In fact, one of the first descriptions comes from the Roman physician Scribonius Largus, who recommends a rather strange treatment for a number of ailments, which is to step on an electric fish, such as the torpedo ray, which are capable of delivering a quite powerful electric shock. However, the mainstream use of electrotherapy would have to await the development of methods for reliably producing electricity. So at the end of the 18th century, the Italian scientist Luigi Galvani famously discovered that if he touched frog legs with instruments of different metals, the legs would twitch. And the conclusion he drew from this was that he had discovered some sort of animal electricity, a vis viva, a vital spark that underpinned all life on Earth. However, almost immediately, a fellow Italian, Alessandro Volta, realized that Galvani had simply created a chemical reaction between the two metal instruments and the frog's legs, creating electricity that made the legs twitch. And he used this observation to create the voltaic pile, the world's first chemical battery. Nonetheless, the idea that electricity was the spark of life and that you could treat different diseases by infusing the body with electricity really caught on. And while this might seem like a strange principle to us today, it wasn't really that far out at the time. We have to remember that until well into the 19th century, medicine was dominated by the four humors theory, which held that the body was filled with four fundamental humors or fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, and that disease was caused by an imbalance of any of these four humors, and that the purpose of medicine was to correct this balance through things like bloodletting or purging. And so the idea that there was only one vital fluid that created life and sustained life, and that you could cure diseases by topping up this fluid, wasn't really that outlandish at the time. And indeed, these experiments of animal carcasses being made to twitch and open their eyes and what have you with electricity would inspire such works of fiction as Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Now, initially, electrotherapy was carried out using static electricity generators like the Wimshurst machine or early capacitors such as the Leyden jar. And then later, with the development of the principle of the dynamo, you started seeing electrotherapy machines that consisted of a little wooden box with a hand crank generator and a pair of electrodes for applying the electricity to the patient. And then there were quack practitioners who claimed to be using electricity, but really had no sort of electrical apparatus in their treatment at all. People like Franz Mesmer, from which we derive the term mesmerize, and who pioneered what we now call hypnotism. He would often get his patients to hold on to a chain, which he said that he had charged with animal electricity or animal magnetism, but really it was just part of the whole hypnotic suggestion. And then when we get into the mid to late 19th centuries, we start getting a whole host of consumer products claiming to be based on electricity. Electric garters and corsets and belts and shoe insoles and hairbrushes and pretty much anything else that you can imagine. But most of them didn't contain any electrical components at all. At most, they would have wires that weren't connected to anything or permanent magnets. And we see the same sort of thing today in bracelets made of copper or with permanent magnets in them that are supposed to stimulate blood flow and help with all sorts of other complaints. And indeed, we see this all throughout history. Whenever there is a huge paradigm-shifting scientific discovery, the quack medicine market quickly jumps on the bandwagon and tries to exploit it. We saw this with radiation, where a whole bunch of products had radium put into them, often with disastrous results. We saw this with genetic engineering and quantum theory and nanotechnology, etc., etc. It's a pattern that repeats quite often. However, at around the same time, in the mid to late 19th century, a more mainstream electrotherapy movement started to take hold in the medical field. And this really started in 1856 with the work of a French physician named Guillaume Duchesne, who conducted a number of experiments on the effects of electricity on the human body. And he not only found, like many previous scientists, that electricity can induce muscle contraction, but also that alternating current was superior for this purpose to direct current, and also that at high frequencies, alternating current could induce a warming sensation deep within the muscle tissue. And this became known as thermophoradism or thermopenetration, but is today known as diathermy. And Duchesne suggested that these two effects, diathermy and electrical muscle stimulation, could be used in physical therapy to help rebuild damaged muscles. And indeed, during the First and Second World Wars, the US Army would experiment extensively with these methods for helping wounded soldiers, and diathermy is still used to this day in physical therapy. Now, 30 years later, in 1889, another Frenchman, Jacques-Arsène d'Arceval, made another key discovery, which was that at frequencies of over 4,000 hertz, electricity doesn't induce muscle contractions or the sensation of pain or electrocution, making it perfect for medical applications. And d'Arceval developed a special coil to produce such electricity. Now, as we'll soon find out, several different inventors came up with very similar devices at the same time, so let's have a look at how these actually work. So d'Arceval's coil consisted of an AC power source, a capacitor bank, a spark gap, and an induction coil. And how this works is that the capacitor charges up and then discharges across the spark gap, sending a pulse of electricity through the induction coil, which steps up the voltage. This repeats over and over again at a high frequency, producing high frequency, high voltage electricity. However, as the circuit only had a single primary induction coil, it was limited to voltages of around 30 kilovolts. Now, a few years later, in 1893, yet another Frenchman, Paul-Marie Houdin, came up with a coil of his own, which made a number of improvements to d'Arceval's design. So the first thing he did was to add another capacitor bank, effectively splitting the circuit into two. And this was primarily for safety reasons, as it isolated the patient from the high amperage, low frequency primary side of the circuit. And as we know, amperage is what kills. He also added a secondary coil linked to the first, creating something called an autotransformer. So the primary coil will have fewer windings of a thicker wire, and this is connected to a secondary coil with more windings of a thinner wire, thus stepping up the voltage to much higher levels. And then finally, we get to the most famous of these types of coils, which is the Tesla coil, or in this context, the Tesla-Thomson coil, which was co-invented by Serbian inventor Nikola Tesla and the British inventor Elihu Thomson. And here, the secondary coil is not directly connected to the primary coil, but rather magnetically coupled to it. It's separate. So the high-frequency magnetic field produced by the primary coil is picked up by the secondary coil and stepped up to a higher voltage. So what's interesting to note here is that when it was first designed, the Ude coil was monopolar, meaning that one end of its coil was grounded, leaving just one electrode for applying to the patient. Whereas the Tesla coil was bipolar. It had two electrodes coming off the coil, one end of which the patient would grip, while the other would be wielded by the doctor. However, if you've ever built a Tesla coil yourself or seen the blueprints for one, you'll know that this has since switched, and today the most common design for a Tesla coil is monopolar. One end of the secondary coil is grounded, whereas the other is typically attached to a toroidal or spherical top load, forming one plate of a giant capacitor. So in the late 19th century, medical versions of all three of these coils, the Delsaval, the Houdin, and the Tesla-Thomson, started being manufactured by all sorts of different companies and started appearing in doctors' offices all around the world. And these were used to treat all sorts of complaints, from skin disorders to nervous disorders to cancer. And how a typical treatment would go is that the patient would be made to either hold on to or stand on a grounding plate while the doctor wielded the other electrode. And there were a couple of different ways of applying electricity to the body. One of the most famous was called the effluvium method, and this involved applying a corona or brush discharge to the body. And so the application wand would include a bunch of sharp electrodes to promote the production of a corona discharge, and the doctor would simply sweep this over the patient's body. There was also something known as the condensing couch, which was a special piece of furniture that the patient would lie on, and it was directly connected to the coil, allowing electricity to be applied to the entire body all at once. But what happened if the doctor wanted to apply electricity close to the body, and indeed into orifices such as the mouth, the ears, the nose, or the genitals? Well, for this, they would use something called a vacuum electrode. And to show you how this works, let's actually have a look at a genuine piece of doctor's office electrotherapy equipment. So here we have a Fischer Model V diathermy machine, and this is produced by the F.G. Fischer Company of Chicago, Illinois, sometime in the late 1920s. Haven't been able to pin down the exact date of its introduction, but it doesn't appear in the company's 1926 catalog. It does appear in its 1930 catalog. Now, this particular unit was used at the psychiatric facility in Brandon, Manitoba, a couple of hours west of Winnipeg. But despite the location, this wasn't used for any sort of psychiatric treatment, but rather for physical therapy, for diathermy and general electrotherapy. Indeed, these larger units were often sold with all sorts of bells and whistles. You could use them for diathermy, for general electrotherapy, for generating ozone, for treating lung disorders. You could use them to power X-ray machines, all sorts of different things. And if we look inside, we'll see that this is the exact same mechanism as the earlier medical coils. So here we have our iron core primary transformer, which provides high voltage AC electricity to the circuit. We have our big capacitor bank. And then at the top here, behind this window, we have our row of spark gaps for exciting the circuit. Other controls here, we have our master ammeter here. We have our selector switch for the range of the ammeter, either one scale or the other. We have a pair of fuses. We have our on-off switch. We have our power selector dial. And then we have a number of terminals for attaching our accessories, which go from the indifferent terminal all the way up to our highest voltage. And on the side here, we have a connection for a foot pedal so that the doctor could use the machine hands-free. And to apply the electricity to the body, we open up this drawer and we find our vacuum electrodes. So what these are is a form of what's known as a Geissler tube, which is a glass tube that has been partially evacuated, so it contains a small amount of low-pressure air. And when high-frequency electricity is run through this, it glows a very distinctive purple. And the idea behind this is that this will step down the current coming out of the machine to a level that is safe to actually apply to the human body. And these were made in all sorts of shapes and sizes in order to apply the electricity to every part of the human body, including inside various orifices. And because of the color that this gave out, which is the standard discharge color for air, these were also known as violet ray tubes or violet ray generators. Now, interestingly, although the trend for electrotherapy eventually faded out, the violet ray wand actually took on a life of its own, thanks to a clairvoyant and quack medical practitioner named Edgar Gates, who ascribed all sorts of healing properties to this mysterious glowing ray. And so all sorts of companies started producing violet ray machines, which you could buy and use to treat pretty much anything, long after electrotherapy had fallen out of favor in the mainstream medical community. And by the 1930s and 1940s, violet ray machines were so well known that they actually made their way into an important piece of pop culture, which was the very first issue of Wonder Woman, published in 1942. And in that issue, Wonder Woman uses a violet ray or purple ray machine, very obviously inspired by these devices, to resurrect her love interest, Stephen Trevor. And here, from the museum's collection, we have 3 different violet ray machines made by 3 different companies. These date from around the 1930s, 1940s. And you'll see that these are really very simple. We'll go over the mechanism behind these in a little bit, but these produce high-frequency, high-voltage electricity that is run through an insulated wand, and then you have a number of evacuated glass wands to apply the electricity, or the violet rays, to the body, and they're differently shaped depending on what area of the body that you're applying them to. Now, these continued to be manufactured in the United States until 1951, when they were banned by the FDA due to false advertising claims. However, they continued to be produced in other countries and imported, and indeed, you can still buy violet ray machines today. There is still a loyal following surrounding them. And typically, these will take the form of a commercial neon sign testing coil into which you can plug various specially made violet ray tubes. And you can even buy these devices for use in cosmetology or aesthetics. And indeed, I remember going once for a facial at an esthetician's, and she waved one of these wands over my skin, claiming that the electricity produced ozone, which had antibacterial properties. And this is true. This is one of the proven effects of these types of devices. However, a lot of the literature will state that the antibacterial effect comes from ultraviolet light. However, these are typically made of regular borosilicate glass, which typically doesn't allow a lot of ultraviolet light to go through. So if there is some ultraviolet light getting through, its effect is probably minimal. And the other main effect that this type of device would have on the skin is to dry it out, which could be useful in treating certain types of skin disorders. Now, the violet ray machines were far from the only electrotherapy devices designed for home use. Indeed, very shortly after the introduction of the large professional medical coils for use in doctors' offices, a number of manufacturers started producing a dizzying array of smaller units for private use, and these became known as medical batteries or home batteries. These were sold on the open market through mail-order companies such as Montgomery Ward and Sears and Roebuck, and often the same companies that made the professional high-end coils for doctors also made the home batteries. And they would go about this in several ways. Some companies would produce really elaborate devices for doctors in these elegant wooden cabinets covered in dials, very intimidating, very professional looking, whereas the home batteries were very plain and simple, whereas in many cases, the home batteries and the professional batteries were one and the same, just marketed differently. So the medical versions would have very sedate names like Office Battery Number 4, whereas the commercially sold batteries would have, very evocative names like the Rejuvenator. So this market created quite a bit of consternation within the medical community. Doctors really hated medical batteries, but not, however, because they considered them to be quackery. After all, they were offering the exact same treatments in their own offices. Rather, they thought that these devices would dilute their professional credibility and, let's be honest, steal away some of their business. And when you read some of these screeds by doctors of the era condemning medical batteries, they're trying very hard not to just come out and say, well, this is stealing business away from us. So I have two examples of medical batteries here from the 1930s, both manufactured by companies out of Toronto, Ontario. So let's have a look at the smaller one first. So this is a North Pole battery manufactured by J. Stevens and Sons. And like pretty much all home batteries, this runs not off of a spark-excited oscillator circuit like in the larger professional medical coils, but rather on a simpler circuit typically known as an induction coil or sometimes a Ruhmkorff coil after the German inventor Heinrich Ruhmkorff, who popularized its use around 1851. However, it was invented quite a few years earlier in 1836 by Charles Page and Nicholas Callan. So this works by converting a low voltage DC current from a battery into a high frequency, high voltage current through the use of an induction coil. So inside this coil right here, we have a primary coil with a smaller number of large windings and then a secondary coil wrapped around it with a large number of smaller windings, which steps up the voltage. However, you can't just run the direct current from the battery through the coil. You need a varying magnetic field. So this is accomplished by pulsating the current using an interrupter. And this is a very similar mechanism to a doorbell. So we have this spring-loaded contact here, and when the coil is energized, it produces a magnetic field that draws that contact towards it, and then that breaks the circuit, causing the magnetic field to collapse and causing the contact to spring back, where it completes the circuit, energizes the coil, gets drawn away, breaks the circuit, and over again. And that creates the pulsating current you need to produce high-frequency, high-voltage electricity. However, compared to the larger medical coils, this is very limited in terms of the voltage and the frequency that you can attain. So the faster the oscillation, the greater the voltage when the circuit was broken, meaning it would strike a very hot arc, which could wear out the terminal very quickly and eventually burn out the whole unit. So these were limited to around 200 hertz and a couple thousand volts. Now, this type of induction coil technology wasn't just limited to medical devices. In fact, it was widely used in car ignition systems. Indeed, this is a Kingston ignition coil out of a Model T Ford, and it works in exactly the same way. You have a double-layer induction coil inside the box, and you have your interrupter on the outside here with your spring-loaded contact and your adjustment screw. And this would supply high-frequency, high-voltage electricity to the car's spark plugs, and the same sort of system is still used today on many vehicles. And if we go back briefly to the violet ray machines, you'll see that they work in the exact same way. They've got a simple induction coil powered by an interrupter. And these can actually be plugged in, so let me do that and show you how that works. Anyway, let's actually have a look at the controls and other design details on the North Pole battery. If we lift up the cover here, we will reveal a quite monstrous battery that powers the unit. This is a 1.5 volt dry cell of a type commonly used at the time for telephones. Now on the top surface here, we have our induction coil, we have our interrupter on the side, we have our on-off switch, and we have a sliding core for adjusting the output current. And finally, here we have our 3 taps for attaching the application electrodes, which are of a very common hollow cylinder type. And according to the instructions on the lid, by selecting different combinations of the 3 taps, you can adjust the voltage. And this works because each of these taps is attached to a different segment of the coil, so that by selecting the different combinations of taps, you're selecting a larger or smaller number of windings, thus stepping up the voltage by a larger or smaller amount. Now let's have a look at the other coil, which is manufactured by the Charles Branston Company, also of Toronto. This is laid out very similarly to the North Pole battery. We have our induction coil on top with the interrupter and its adjustment screw and a sliding core for adjusting current. Here we have a 3-position knob for selecting the batteries. So position 0 is off, position 1 is 1 battery connected, and position 2 is 2 batteries connected. Then finally we have our 3 taps for attaching our accessories. And not only does this allow you to select the output voltage, but according to the instructions on the lid, also allows you to choose between galvanic and faradic current. And this is simply old-fashioned terminology for direct current and alternating current. But possibly the neatest part of this coil is this compartment in the bottom, which contains our accessories. So here you have the grounding plate that you would place your hand or your foot on, and we have a pair of handles that attach to the terminals, and these can be fitted with either our traditional hollow cylinder electrodes, some pancake electrodes, or a roller electrode. So really neat to see this unit with all of its accessories still intact. However, by the time that these medical batteries were produced in the late 1920s, early 1930s, the electrotherapy trend in medicine had pretty much run its course for a number of reasons. First, there were other discoveries that were made at the time, including the discovery of X-rays and radiation, that really stole the spotlight from electricity as the miracle cure du jour. Also, developments in psychiatry, especially the development of Freudian psychoanalysis, reduced the demand for electrical cures for nervous disorders. However, certain forms of electrotherapy are still used to this day, including diathermy and electrical muscle stimulation, or EMS, which are still used in physiotherapy for helping to heal damaged muscles. There's also something called transcutaneous electrical nerve stimulation, or TENS, which is used in pain relief for people with arthritis or neuralgia and other sorts of disorders. And it's not quite understood how this works, and it's not quite proven that it does work, but one theory is the pain gate hypothesis, which holds that in the spinal cord there are pain gates that will either allow or not allow pain signals to reach the brain, and through electrical stimulation you can cause those gates to close and stop pain signals from being transmitted. However, as with all of these electrical devices, the data is really inconclusive as to whether they are actually effective, and a lot of it might actually be placebo effects. But hey, if it works, it works. And of course, as has always been the case, electrotherapy persists on the quack medicine market, especially in the form of electrical muscle stimulators that claim to eliminate the need for exercise by stimulating the muscles directly, allowing you to lie back and relax while your muscles build themselves. And one of the most infamous examples of one of these devices was the relaxicizer introduced in the 1960s. You'll probably remember this from an episode of the show Mad Men, where Peggy discovers that the relaxicizer has, let's say, other stimulating properties. However, while in real life the relaxicizer was not known to have any sexually stimulating properties, it was responsible for quite a few cases of cardiac arrest, paralysis, and other horrific accidents. And so in 1970, it was banned by the FDA. And it was considered to be such a dangerous product that all remaining examples were ordered to either be destroyed or disabled before they were sold onto the collector's market. Nonetheless, you can still find devices like these sold on the market today. So the more things change, the more things stay the same. Anyway, that's all I have for you today. Thank you so much for watching, and a huge shout out to the Manitoba Electrical Museum for allowing me to go through their collection, pull out these items, and film this video. They have a fascinating collection here, lots of really interesting things, and I hope to do a lot more videos with them in the near future, so stay tuned for that. In the meantime, I'm Jean Messier from Our Own Devices. Have a great day.